Yeah, I mean it's a PvP marketplace. Uh, these exchanges talk a lot about how it's like you don't have to be smarter than the house; you need to be smarter than your neighbor. Well, you're depending on the market, you're playing against not your random neighbor, but your PhD statistician neighbor. If liquidity is gone by the time you see this, that might be a small dog who took it.
Hey everyone, welcome to Small Dog Trading. This is going to be our second episode with myself and Andrew. Andrew, how's it going?
Well, I got rinsed on those Grammy bets, which we can get into in a minute, but yeah, lots of interesting stuff going on in prediction markets.
Certainly. So, yeah, I think the topic for today is going to be AI and prediction markets, decision making, and then we'll get into some interesting markets that are going on now generally as well. But yeah, let's hop right into your Grammy bet, Andrew. So I know you wrote about this on Substack a few months ago and had made some trades on Kalshi, but do you mind kind of giving folks an overview of how that went?
Yeah, so I'll share my screen here. Um, the idea was I found this market that had close to zero volume, was on a pretty obscure topic, and had liquidity rewards. So market makers were incentivized with money to provide more liquidity on the book. So this leads to much bigger, deeper markets than you'd get without an incentive. Traders respond to incentives. That's how markets work. So you had these markets that had never really traded, but had a lot more liquidity than comparable illiquid markets. So I thought, okay, these are likely to be a softer market. I don't know anything about the Grammys, or I've never even listened to these albums. Uh, but I thought, okay, maybe the person who put up these quotes hasn't done a whole lot of work either, and no one's traded against them. So it might just be one or two people pricing this market rather than, the maybe 100 really informed traders on a more efficient market. So I had been trying to use LLMs for forecasting for a while. Um, I've had pretty mixed results. I had slightly better results with the thinking ChatGPT model and asking it to walk through pricing the contract like a super forecaster. So there's a great book, Super Forecasting, you can pick up, and it has a guide on what makes better forecasts, what are various techniques good forecasters use, what are characteristics of good forecasters. The base idea when I do forecasting is what is the base rate of a contract? And so if there are, um, say, 5 potential winners of this Grammy and you know nothing, you say, okay, well, maybe it's 20% each. And then you could look a little further about like, okay, who tends to win this type of award? What niches are there? Producers that continuously win? Are there types of albums? Is it correlated with commercial sales or not, depending on the category? Um, so what? So you're building up a data set of historically who tends to win this category, and you're trying to nudge up or down from that 20% each to incorporate that information of statistical factors that relate to past winners. And it seems like LLM should be able to do an okay job at this. They can pull the past winners for this category. They can look at characteristics of each album, what critics have said about it, compare it to past winners. So it's not outlandish that they could do better than a straight 20%, say, for 5 winners.
Hmm.
And so I tried having it priced on these categories like a super forecaster. I followed up with a couple questions where I thought it might have gotten some things wrong. Wish it did sometimes. And then I made some bets. I traded mostly one level in each market, and traded a couple different categories. Uh, Total bet was about 20,000 notional. And as I put in the article, I did not have a strong model. I do not think this would have been competitive at all in an efficient market. I'm mostly betting that these prices are pretty uninformed. And because I had tried using AI with other models and had gotten pretty poor results, I thought maybe if my competition was doing something similar, I might be able to beat them. Turns out the bets went horrible. I lost about $9,000 in the bets. And again, as I wrote about, well, how much do I update my priors on that this is a good bet based on this result? And you can do some stats math on, how likely am I to get this result if my fair values were actually true? Like, how bad of a beat is it? Without looking at that math, I don't think I can learn a ton from this. These binary bets have a lot of variance. However, as I noted before the results came out, having tried to experiment a little bit more with these tools since I made these bets, I found they can be very noisy, even when asked the same question in different ways. And one thing I would do was I'd create an anonymous session so it doesn't know any of my history. And I'd ask it to price this market again. I'd vary the prompt a little bit, and I would get different numerical results each time by a couple percent. So that upfront tells me there's just a lot of noise in this model. Um, and so in retrospect, I think I could have done more work on my end and use the tools more as collecting the base rate data and giving me inferences about who is likely to win what category, and then pricing the probabilities more myself, and then maybe doing too much in one prompt. What do you think, Aaron?
Yeah, so I think it was an interesting exercise and unfortunate that it didn't go your way. But it's not about making money on a single bet. It's more about trying to have plus expected value. But so I guess a few things in mind here. Like one important concept was that there were incentives around this, right? So having liquidity incentives and this being a pretty brand new market makes it so that the sharps haven't necessarily like repriced it. Like the price discovery hadn't really happened, whereas there were like really tight spreads. So I think that was like one important kind of prerequisite to possibly using AI. And then you mentioned like using like the thinking model and like thinking like a super forecaster. So I'm curious, like what models are you using, and do you have like a go-to prompt, or is it just think like a super forecaster and try to get to the fair value of these?
For this, and the models are changing so fast that even since I did this, I think the Claude Opus 4.5 is really great, and I need to test it more, but it might actually be better than the current ChatGPT thinking. So I'm using whatever the latest thinking model is, and I test between platforms. I'll use the same prompt on multiple platforms and see how different the answers are. Um, when I first started doing this, the ChatGPT thinking was much better. I think Claude has caught up quite a bit. And I've also gotten mostly terrible results from Gemini, which is a little surprising because I like it in other ways. But it has come up with some really bad, really noisy answers. One other concept I think it's important to think about is, let's say I'm trading completely randomly on these markets. Whatever ChatGPT spits out is total garbage. How bad are my trades? So each of these markets is a penny wide. If the true fair was mid market, and I'm not saying it necessarily is, but let's say it's not biased in either direction, then when I cross the spread, I'm losing half a penny plus my fees, which Kalshi has that kind of unique downward parabola fee structure that peaks at 50 cents and drops towards 1.99. So my loss on each trade in expectancy is going to be half a penny plus fees times the number of contracts. And so for this to be a good trade in expected value, I don't have to be right half the time. I need to be right, depending on what my edge is, better than that noisy estimate.
Hmm.
Now, the one time you can get in trouble with this is, let's say that the markets are actually leaned the wrong way. And so I'm I'm buying something, and for whatever reason, the current quote is too high. So I'm not just giving up half the spread, I'm giving it more. I think that's super unlikely for markets like this. They haven't even traded. Why would the markets be biased in some direction? But when you get towards, say, a really popular market that's trading a lot, and maybe there's kind of an obvious dumb answer. Maybe people systematically overpay for like Taylor Swift or something. And so the kind of less informed side of the market might actually be bad by more than half a penny. So that's a question to ask yourself. Even though the market's penny wide, might it be leaned in some direction due to flow, due to like more uninformed people on one side of the market? Or maybe there's a football team that has more fans. And so markets that are tight can be leaned in a way like that. And that's a question you have to ask yourself when you're thinking, how good is this trade?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting take. And given that these are peer-to-peer markets, like that bias will actually show up. So the Taylor Swift example, I think a lot of traders would clearly say that like Bad Bunny as the top Spotify artist was very mispriced. And that was, pretty much a bond towards the end of the year. So going back to like the market types that you would consider for using AI or not consider, I'm wondering if like market efficiency might be one of the core features. So like would you use this for like the Fed rate markets or something like that? Or are there any other market dynamics that would come into play?
Right. So a couple things on where AI might be helpful. I talked about building up a base rate data set and using it to incorporate some factors on what's going on in the market. For the Fed, the price discovery, a lot of it's happening in a different market. A lot of it's happening in the Fed fund rate futures market. Kalshi is unique in that you can bet on the full spectrum of values. So you're not just getting the kind of expected interest rate. You get actual probability distribution across all the different outcomes, which is, I think, a great feature of Kalshi markets compared to just a Fed future. But that Fed funds future trades a ton of volume. It's extremely liquid. And all else equal, markets that are trading more are going to be more efficient. So even though this March Fed decision only has 3 million volume, which is a lot for a Kalshi market, but still tiny compared to a big TradFi market, uh, there's a huge, huge amount of volume in those futures. And your prior should be that the market is fairly efficient. So these markets start to being based on that. Um, in the tails that are, less, at least not obvious to back out from the futures price, maybe it's a little bit less efficient. Um, but you should have you need a much sharper angle to make a bet in this market than, some zero liquidity incentivized market elsewhere on Kalshi. Your prior here should be much higher that the market's efficient. Um, not saying it's impossible to make money, but you should have a different starting prior.
Yeah. So put it in a prompt and it says Fed maintains rate 95% in Gemini, you're not going to just blast that market necessarily. And I think it's interesting that like um, there are TradFi equivalents, right? So it's like this is not a new market type. It's just putting something that already exists on prediction market rails. Would it be like CME Group? That's the one of the primary. Is it
Yeah,
exchange or what for that?
there's a
Yeah.
bunch of futures exchanges around the globe. But the Fed rates feature it's a very liquid, popular product. Um, and related to this, where I think AI is bad in general, is any market that is highly quantitative. So AI is good at reading a bunch of articles and compiling information, giving you a background data set, but it is not good at generating quantitative estimates by itself. These Bitcoin markets, where is Bitcoin going to be in 15 minutes? The people that are trading this are using some kind of options pricing model that has some volatility, very short-term volatility estimate, some distribution estimate. They're using a fast feed to update quickly based on Bitcoin's price move, and then they're using some kind of market making algorithm to update quickly. So this is a quantitative trading pipeline type product. It is not a let's sit back and forecast type product. The edge you have in this market, uh, aside from real tail cases, is having great infrastructure to trade it, a decent enough model of short-term vol estimate. Again, that's a quant project, fast feeds to update, and incorporating that quickly in a market price and updating and canceling quickly on Kalshi, et cetera. So it's not a tourist market. It's a market for people that have that infrastructure. So AI is going to be completely useless in this market, other than maybe giving you ideas on how to set up infrastructure, and then you go program in Python or C++ or whatever, or use, maybe there's an opportunity to, if you have programming skills, to build something. But other than that, AI is not going to really help you.
Makes sense. Yeah. So anything that's like quantitative that could be like programmatically used, like in this example we're looking at right here, it's like it's not for the casual trader, right? They're basically seeing here the price is like 70 to 80 cents. So I think that would make the fee one maybe a little over 1 cent. So they're saying, we're going to do a take your order at 85 cents if the fair value is 87 cents and above, and basically just have something that automatically does that.
Yeah, and I don't know. There's probably some edge in making the best market, and then some in being the fastest. If somebody's leaving limit orders out there to take them when the trade becomes good, but it is not a good tourist market. Um,
Yeah.
Another type that I don't think is a good tourist market is these temperature markets.
Hmm.
And when I think about markets, I think about who's the final boss of this market. Who is the toughest trader to play against? I think about Bowser. You get to the last level in Mario. Like, who am I fighting against to win the princess? So the final boss of the crypto market is some kind of, maybe it's not the best high frequency trader in the world, because I don't think these markets are ultra competitive, but it's somebody in that direction. And if these markets get bigger, it's going to be just plugged into the fastest short-term crypto option pricing in the world. These temperature markets, there's a very niche uh, set of information that you need to price these markets. They have very specific definitions. So the Philadelphia one is the Philadelphia airport, as reported by the National Weather Service's climatological report. So it's not what does AccuWeather say? It's not weather.com say. It's this specific report at a specific station today. I started looking at this with AI, not to actually say what is the temperature today, but what information should I know if I was going to trade this market? Like, how big is the gap between what I know today and what whoever the final boss is might be doing? And so I do think AI is valuable for this. One thing I enjoy is using mostly Gemini for deep research. I also use ChatGPT and Claude, but I think Gemini is pretty good at doing search and combining all that information. I probably do 5 deep research reports a day on a whole variety of topics. So this one, I gave it a super simple prompt: deep dive on the data sources and processes necessary to beat the Kalshi weather markets. I'm a beginner to weather, so please define relevant terms. And it comes up with a multi-page report, basics of Kalshi, what source it uses. Again, there's multiple weather sources, and then a whole bunch of stuff I didn't even know I didn't know. So there's this METAR number that updates at different rates. There's various types of instrumentation. There's where in the city is this weather sensor, and it varies by city. They note that the Chicago sensor is at O'Hare, and that rapid fluctuations from wind shifts off Lake Michigan could impact the pricing. There's just so much I don't know here about how volatile weather is under different climate patterns. How the pricing, you look at clouds or winds over some area. I have no idea how that works. I think it's fascinating, but there are people that study this information in detail. And so the final boss here is somebody who has a full meteorological background, who is pricing live weather data statistically knows a whole bunch about the specific area. So, Aaron, what markets have you been looking at recently?
Yeah, I'll pull up my screen. It's been an interesting week between Fed chair, government shutdown, among some other items. Okay, so let's first look at the Fed chair market. So Trump did announce that Kevin Warsh was going to be his nomination. And it does look like some people have proposed this to settle, even though I don't know if this has met the resolution criteria. But yeah, it was quite an interesting race where at one point Kevin Hassett had almost up to 85% chance. And then Rick Reeder, who is kind of the BlackRock executive, he took the lead for a little while. Ultimately, Kevin Warsh took it. But there is Judy Shelton, who still has a 1.5% chance, which is a little odd to me, to be honest.
Yeah, Aaron, what is going on with Judy Shelton?
I don't know, man. It's, like a 60x hit that you could get right here. I guess I think in the latest Epstein files, pretty much everyone was mentioned, but I'm pretty sure Kevin Warsh, I heard something about him being in them. So I don't know if anything could happen there.
Oh, we should verify that. And worth looking. What are the resolution criteria on Polymarket and Kalshi for this? Are they different?
Yeah, good question. And I think that's also like a really good use case of AI to actually be able to analyze that. So here for Polymarket, the primary resolution source will be the official information from the US Senate. And then they kind of have a vague consensus of credible reporting may also be used.
So it's the
Uh,
formal nomination defined by the submission of a nomination message to the U.S. Senate. So Trump has to send the formal nomination to the Senate. I think that's similar for Kalshi. So it's just right now, I see Shelton is 1.4 bid at 1.6 cents on Poly, and then Kalshi is ticking in pennies, but she's 2 at 3, so a little higher on Kalshi actually. Similarly, Kalshi is nominations sent by the president and received by the U.S. Senate. So that sounds pretty similar. Well, it's always worth noting, Kalshi is decided by their employees, and Polymarket has that UMA process to resolve market. So even two markets with exactly the same text could, in rare cases, resolve differently.
yeah. And I guess the last thing I'll point out is, we can openly see the top holders here. And here's Domer at number 5. I think that he said that this was his second biggest win. He had almost 400K shares. But there are people that have 3 people with over 1 million Judy Shelton shares, one at 2.1 million. They are None of them are winning traders.
That's what I was going to say. Is the smart money this kind of, is this a bond? Is this like are we trading against a conspiracy theorist who's willing to put up $20,000 to potentially have a massive win? Where do you think the smart money is?
I think it's I think it's a bond personally. I also think that there is something to do with what kind of like the risk-free rate is on prediction markets, which I think is an interesting topic in itself. But say that the fair value of Kevin Warsh is 99.9, but who knows how long you have to hold this. I pulled up a market for Kevin Warsh being confirmed as Fed chair, which I actually think would be subsequent to the criteria that we just read for the actual nomination. But there is that lag here. So it could be, upwards of a few months, it seems.
Yeah, I actually did a Gemini deep dive into the whole nomination process. Um, and yeah, this is the first step of president sending the nomination to the Senate, and there's a whole bunch of steps subsequent to that. I think it had it as likely a couple weeks to resolve if all goes well. And so if you think about a percent over a month, if it was risk free, roughly 12% a year, right? Plus the interest on your money, at least on Kalshi. Does Polymarket pay interest on your holdings on a bet like this?
No. So they only do it for select like long duration markets. So I would say like the core ones are the 2028 presidential election, but some even like that are a year out, like Russia Ukraine ceasefire. Those awful also offer it. So it's only your traded positions, and it's a 4% APR, I believe.
Uh,
Uh,
is this a position you have on? Again, nothing on the show is advice, but I guess we can talk about our trades. I do have some no on Judy Shelton.
Yep, I have both no on Judy Shelton and yes on Kevin Warsh. Um, yeah, that was ended up being pretty successful for me. I bought a bunch of no shares in Hassett as well. I it doesn't make sense to necessarily like blindly tail someone, but I was looking at uh Domer's top positions. He's the kind of the goat in prediction market land. And he had like massive no positions in Hassett, large yes positions in Warsh. So yeah, it's always interesting to kind of look at what folks are trading as well.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to see a market that had a lot of volume before, but this Judy Shelton thing really is an outlier in how much is trading at a tail price. And so you're always worried: does someone know something I don't? Or is this somebody that's either getting out of a position, which seems unlikely. There's a lot of trading post the announcement. This seems like somebody who has a theory on Judy Shelton, and I think the question is how much, how likely it is you think you're right. Who are you betting against? Is this someone that could really know something? I'm going to go buy a little bit more no on Shelton here.
Yeah. One other thing before we kind of move on is both in Polymarket and Kalshi, the volume on Judy Shelton is way higher than Kevin Warsh. So you'll see here it's almost 50 million for her, and then Kevin Warsh is just over 30. Interesting market. So I was thinking we also hop into the government shutdown markets, given that government just reopened yesterday. So it ended up being 4+ days. But this is one really interesting example of comparing cross exchange. So the poly market resolution criteria was, I believe, at like midnight for each day, whereas the Kelshi resolution was 10 a.m. Eastern time the following day. So I did some comparisons looking at the prices of like, the midnight to the 10 a.m. next day. And generally the Kelshi price was a few percent lower, given that there could be, the bill passed in Congress, but maybe Trump didn't sign it until the following morning. And I did end up picking up some like no shares, and I think I made a few $100 there. But I also noticed that for the 5+ day, Domer actually had massive positions in this being yes, and I think he took a loss here, but ultimately he actually made a lot of money trading on Kelshi. So I think he was doing kind of the opposite strategy there, particularly buying this bump right here. So yesterday, when the House was voting, they're basically voting to say, will this bill be passed forward? And I'm learning some of this stuff along the way, so I don't understand all the criteria, but like, are we going to basically allow like 1 hour to pass this moving forward? And there was one Republican that voted nay, and then everyone else was party lines. But there was this really quick blip. One other interesting thing is just regarding the resolution source, being the OPM, or the Office of Personnel Management. Is that right? But there was kind of a controversy on a past market where the website literally wasn't updated by like the midnight threshold. So like the trade kind of like flipped overnight, and people were tweeting at this guy, Scott Kupar, who's the director of the OPM. Um, and now he's kind of getting waves that like he's calling it polls, but referring to prediction markets about them updating their site in time. So I told him he's become famous in the prediction market land. But yeah, he's engaging with the prediction market community a little.
Very interesting. There's always the question of Does the existence of a market shape reality? In this case, it may have, right? The website may not have been updated had a user not reached out to this guy about, hey, can you make sure the website's updated? In terms of, you know, call it, some people might say, oh, it's manipulation. This to me seems softer. Like you're not really changing the facts. He's asking about a website updated. You're not. I wouldn't say you're interfering with a process here. So again, not a legal opinion, but this type of thing seems fine to me. Disrupting a sporting event, for example, would not be fine. I think that's on the dumb side. Um, but this doesn't seem like the bad kind of manipulation, even if it did change the result.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I think that we could talk more sometime about the positive and negative externalities of some prediction markets. But in this case, even if they are promoting their own bag per se to be like, let's update the market, that's something that the government should do anyway to some extent. So I think that's fine.
All right, Aaron, that old timey music you're hearing is our unpaid shilling of the week, and we do not have any sponsors or advertisers of this show, but both of us could use some practice in salesmanship and shilling. So we're going to shill products that we have no affiliation with and are not getting paid for. I'm going to shill Vanguard and other low-cost ETFs. So my background is in ETF trading. One thing about the professional traders I know, in their personal capacities, a lot of them have really boring portfolios. Most of my savings is in a handful of broad, very cheap stock market and some bond funds. I like Vanguard has been a leader in cutting fees and has saved Americans a truly insane amount of money. So I would call them real American heroes. Personally, a big fan of what they've done in the space to make it more competitive, and that's my unpaid shill of the week.
Love it. Yeah, as much as I'll trade on prediction markets and I do some own like stock picking, I would say it's more for fun. I don't think I'm actually beating the market, and the vast majority of my personal portfolio and retirement is Vanguard, international, and US.
Should we talk about some Super Bowl bets?
Let's go, man. I know we're not big sports people on our end, but it's very timely, and there's quite a lot going on. So of course there's just betting on the actual game, but there's prop bets. There's bets on Bad Bunny. What's his opener going to be? What songs is he gonna play? I don't know if I'd want to trade in those markets. How about you, Andrew?
Well, just when Aaron says that we're not sports fans, or when I say I'm not a sports fan, I had to look up this morning who was going to be playing the Super Bowl. So that's kind of the level I'm on. So am I
Okay.
making sports bets? Like, absolutely not. No edge of them. Or the only time I would do it is if there was like an arbitrage between markets. I know nothing. Some of the other markets though, on like I have not researched this, but what will the opener song be? You could make a case for pulling some base rates of like what does the opening song tend to be in terms of like style at past Super Bowl performances, in terms of is it like their biggest hit or do they save their biggest hit for later? So you could plausibly construct a base rate on that. And you could also look at how does Bad Bunny like to open his shows, um, look through his sequence in concerts or other appearances he's done. And so the question is always, I have this base rate. How do I map it to this specific event? And it's a little tricky here. The other problem I see in this market is someone could just know. You don't want to
Hmm.
make big bets into a situation where somebody just 100% knows the answer. And I'm not saying that's particularly the case here, but there are some markets where no one really knows who's going to win the election. Right? I guess if you could look inside the mind of every American before the election, you could figure it out. But
Hmm.
there's no even the most well-placed insider doesn't know for sure. On something like this, somebody could be writing the set list and just know, and there could be a bunch of people around them that just know. And so you could be exposed to more selection. So I would ask we talked about who's the big boss. Maybe it's this guy Gayton who's talked about his database of like Spotify and Rotten Tomatoes information. And there's a great Novig podcast with him on a show called Predictive Programming that I highly recommend. It's just really underrated for fans of prediction market predictive
Agree.
programming from
Yeah.
Novig. And we'll put a link in the description to Gayton's episode. So you're trading against like guys like that who are digging into the past data of musical performances, have a lot of context about the artist. And he's talked a fair amount about what he's doing. And when you see people talk about alphas online, this is getting to a more general point. For every person who's sharing some strategy that makes sense, you have to ask, why are they doing it and what are they leaving it out? And in this example, he talked about how this database would be really hard for someone to build. It's some kind of like scraping websites over years to build this custom database. If you have some alpha that's easily replicatable and potentially worth a lot of money, say more than a few $1,000s, you're just not going to share it online. For every one thing that is valuable that you see on social media or X, and there's also a ton of information that's not valuable, nobody's sharing huge value secrets online. So for every one thing you see, there's probably 10 things you don't see. And I'm sure there's a bunch of things from any of these Domer, Gayton, any of these like sharps that they're not telling you. And I'm certainly not sharing. If I did have valuable prediction market trades that are worth a lot of money, I would certainly not share them on this podcast. Even the Grammy thing that I thought was Positivity V, that was, maybe $1,000 and not really replicatable and kind of unique. So you have to be skeptical when you see anybody pitching large edges online.
Absolutely. And there's a ton of noise, and then two, it's like when some of these sharp traders actually share some of their alpha per se. Like one example that comes to note is the last pope that was decided upon, and Domer wrote a lot about this, but I don't think he would necessarily write the same kind of thought process and um, how he got there if this was an event that was going to be recurring, and like happen in the next year, because you're not going to want to share that information if that's the case. But in the Pope version, it's like it might be decades or something before it's decided upon. And I've seen the same thing with Gayton. Like sometimes he'll share kind of the after kind of the look back as to like why he made some of these trades, but again, not when it's recurring, and maybe it's because he's out of money or something like that. Like he can no longer trade it further.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the idea of I have this position on, I like it, right? Um, what you would not want to do is do some trade and put it out there online and talk about how good it is, and then trade out of it the other way. That is not something that that you'd want to do. Not definitely not claiming anyone's doing it, but you do have to be careful around, particularly anonymous, promoting a position when they might actually be trying to get out of it. And there's in the stock market, that's definitely illegal in terms of all these like penny stock scams where they have a big position in some company, they pump it up on social media, and then they try and exit to retail. So always be skeptical when reading about people's positions. And even on Polymarket, where you can see some of the named accounts, there's no telling what other accounts that person has. And if I were a Polymarket sharp, I would be very cognizant of the impact of trades I'm making. And you might want an anonymous account that nobody follows for anything that is illiquid and you're building a big position in. And I would bet that top traders have a bunch of accounts they're using if they know that they're being copy traded.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. One other, I guess, just quick point to circle back to the like the halftime opener and the songs. Um, you had mentioned like one, there's the sharps that are trading these. I do think there is a lot of dumb money inflows to some extent, like on Kalshi, but there's also like this is a massive production, right? Like there's going to be all these like dancers on stage and people that are like working in that production. So I just have a hesitancy like entering a market when there are 80, 100 people that certainly know the answer. So not saying that there is going to be insider trading or something like that, but I'm just like a little more, I have more caution entering that, especially this close to the actual event.
Well, so there's a recent example of that. There was a mention market on, I think it was a late night TV show that was actually taped at, earlier in the day before it, like well before it aired. And so everyone who was in that screening heard exactly the words that the host and the guest said, and so they would know for certain uh, what was going to be played. Now, with the exception of will the show that aired actually be edited to some extent, so maybe there's they'd at least know 100% on like the nose.
Hmm.
And this is just kind of dumb to have a market that exists after the fact. I think it's kind of poor market quality to have a situation where you have a lot of people who know the answer, and these people don't have a duty to not trade on the information. They're in a show. I don't see a duty there. Um, so markets like this should close before the point where a lot of people know the answer, and not just be a way to for people, not call them insiders, but just extremely informed traders to just pick off liquidity elsewhere in the market.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there is varying market quality in addition to what's the benefit of this market? I think to some degree we think that some prediction markets have more value than others. Okay, so one other interesting market that I was looking at on Kalshi is which brands will advertise during the big game. So just being kind of interested in the tech space, I find this interesting, especially some of the AI companies. And some of these, people are also fully aware of. I'm not actively trading it, but interesting to see, OpenAI at 95%, Gemini at 90%, Anthropic 64,
It's a big spread between OpenAI and Anthropic.
Zen, the nicotine company at 3%. Um, yeah, any interesting ones to you?
Well, I was saying that the big spread between Gemini, OpenAI, and Anthropic. Okay, this is Andrew from the future. Aaron and I recorded February 4th. This is the morning of February 5th. And so we were talking about this market, which brands will advertise during the big game. And we discussed it kind of briefly, but I remember mentioning, that's a big spread between Anthropic and OpenAI and Gemini. In the back of my mind, I had remembered I saw an article about Anthropic was playing advertising during the game. Aaron and I didn't go into the rules deeply yesterday, but the price seemed a little off to me. A general lesson in prediction markets is if a price seems like free money, stop and take a beat and do some more research. If it's off by just a little bit to your fair value, it might be fine. But if it looks glaringly off, just stop and don't trade and read the rules. So each market has a title, a rule summary, and then the full rules. The market settled to the description, the full rules. Sometimes that does not agree with what the title, the rule summary, interpretation, or outright says. Always read the full rules. And writing prediction market contracts is really hard. The writers can't possibly think of every corner case, and modeling the real world is just messy. But also sometimes the contracts are written in a way that might clash with what a casual reader or trader would interpret the meaning to be. And it seems like this is one of these cases. Now, this market hasn't resolved. We can see yesterday, hours after our recording, Anthropic's now trading at 14%. It seems like this is one of these corner cases. You can see this important information. If the listed market is a parent company and one of their brands is advertised in otherwise qualifying advertisements, in this case Claude by Anthropic, Betting on Anthropic would settle to no unless the ad mentions the company, not the brand. The strike settles to no. To me, this is not what a casual reader would think. Seeing Anthropic listed and then reading articles about how Anthropic is about to advertise at the game. But those are the details of the market. Rules are still evolving here. And at least one trader on Twitter seemed to call this and make a bunch of money. The guy Logan posted yesterday about sizing into this trade based on his familiarity with the rules and trading last year. So read the rules, being on X, looking at the Kalshi Discord, talking to other people about corner cases in the past really helps. But this is a spot where had I casually waded into it, could have lost a bunch of money. Okay, back to the regular pod. Would Zyn be allowed to advertise?
I
Maybe that's
kind
something
of
we could
don't
research,
think
right?
so, right? Yeah,
What's
that's a
the
good point. You could buy some 97 cent. There's a few thousand of them.
All right? So the question, like, let's say you find the answer is definitively no. Like, how many dollars can you make on the? It's a few dollars. I mean, it's not what $68 on the 99 cent, about $100 on the 98 cent, about 100. So a few $100
$100.
if you could find this out 100%, at least in terms of liquidity, you could sweep.
Yeah, I
So
would
maybe it's
consider
worth
sweeping those
30 minutes of
97s.
research.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
That's one thing I
Okay.
talk about when you're trading a liquid market. Like, how much is an extra hour of your time worth? And let's say you can get a better estimate of the price of one of these things. Like say there's an example. There's a certain amount of liquidity and trading volume that's just not worth it for. If I'm gonna make $10 and I have to do a bunch of research, it's hardly worth it for anybody to do that. Everybody has their own point in terms of how much more work to make, what's your hourly rate. I've written about this a little bit, but I'll do an hour or two of work on one of these markets purely for nothing. Even when I was in the Good Judgment Project, I spent, 7 hours a week predicting this geopolitical stuff purely for fun. And, I probably spend that amount of time in general on, if I have free time on researching interesting markets. When it comes to building advanced quantitative models where you have to do a bunch of data cleaning and stuff, I don't find that as enjoyable. So I'm not going to spend my free time doing that. But learning about a new market, researching kind of something that helps me understand the world better. And then, maybe there's an example. I'm a research after the show. So if liquidity is gone by the time you see this, that might be a small dog who took it. But, if there was $20 of liquidity edge available for finding the answer, I'm not going to do it. For 300, I'll at least do a little bit of research.
Yeah, well, I might beat you to it, but we'll see. Yeah, so from my perspective, it's like, we're not trying to trade for a living. It's like we're interested in these markets. Like, again, I'm not going to build some crazy model to make like $100, but I do think that like the depth of research can sometimes be more important than the breadth per se. So it's like if you are really trying to make money in this, like there's some value to finding your niche, and whether that's something you're personally interested in or just have some type of edge, that can help.
Yeah, I mean, it's a PvP marketplace. These exchanges talk a lot about how it's like you don't have to be smarter than the house; you need to be smarter than your neighbor. Well, you're depending on the market, you're playing against not your random neighbor, but your PhD statistician neighbor who's been studying this stuff or is like deeply involved in the culture market. So I do think it's pretty misleading to say you're trading against your neighbor and like, yeah, okay, technically he's a peer, but like sometimes your peer is like, my former employer of professional market maker or whoever's top of book at the time, which tends to lean towards professionals. So uh,
Hmm.
think hard about, do I have an edge in this or not? Um, compared to trading a stock, if a stock is 1 basis point wide and you're doing a random trade, you're losing half a basis point on that trade, right? In terms of slippage. And you're always going to lose something if you're a noise trader. If you're trading a 50 cent Kalshi market, so it's 49 bid at 50, and fair is exactly 49.5 cents. Um, with that fee, which is I think 1 3/4 pennies. So you're losing 2 1/4 cents by lifting that 50 offer,
Hmm.
um, which as a percent of your capital is a really high percentage, right? Like if you go around noise trading on these exchanges, I mean, it's similar to a sports book, right? Um, but you're going to lose 4.5% of your capital. Again, similar to like a sports book. But if you do that a lot, when you compare it to the magnitude of money you'd lose trading a liquid stock, uh, it's an order of magnitude higher to noise trade on these. We trade to make money. I don't really trade for entertainment, but you should think about the cost of trading randomly these things, especially if you're trading any significant amount of money.
Yeah, certainly. Cool. Well, I think we'll enjoy at least watching the commercials this weekend. But anything else top of mind for you, Andrew?
Yeah, I wanted to maybe to tease a future episode here, um, and to boost one of my own Twitter posts. So boosters of the space and people that are serious about prediction markets talk a lot about, hey, this could be a great risk transfer tool. People could use it for hedging, right? You can hedge your sports team on one of these things. So, and I don't have a massive Twitter following, but I wanted to know, has anybody done a trade that was for hedging or risk transfer purposes on one of these exchanges, or was it more entertainment, or you think you're winning, or you're moving your sports betting activity over here? Mostly no. There were some people that were doing emotional hedges of saying like, well, I don't want this team to win, but I'll bet on them. Or uh, Doug Campbell says, I bet on Tulsi Hubbard to remain in office, even though I wanted her gone. Uh, Which, that's fine, I guess, to like have new emotional hedges. Uh, Hack Jones talked about possibly hedging whether the gambling loss reduction we repealed. Like, I like that. I think
It's
that's
legit.
the best example so far.
Yeah.
But if you have other use cases, I would love to hear if you would consider using a market like this to hedge. If you're like a small business who has some obscure risk that does not exist to be hedged in the financial market, what contract would actually, if you're paying, say, that half penny spread plus fees to get to offset this risk, what contract would make it so that you'd want to do that? And and one of the nice things about this market being like very flexible and they're able to self-certify new contracts is you can quickly generate new contracts rather than like a lengthy approval process. And so maybe there's some obscure use cases that I'm not thinking of that would actually be really useful for people of risks that they've never been able to hedge before. Maybe you're a florist and like there's like a bad rose season or something, and you can hedge it on uh, a prediction market. So I'd love to hear either have you used it, or are there obscure examples that you'd want to use if they're available in liquid?
Yeah, my quick take on that is one, it's interesting that these prediction markets are kind of touted as like hedging tools, like I feel like it's like hyped a lot more than it's actually used. Like let's be real, like it's mostly sports gambling, or it's mostly just like retail traders. But I am like optimistic about the potential future of like institutions or companies getting involved in that. And someone that's worked in the insurance industry, it's like, there's often like 20% margin or something like that in a lot of like traditional insurances. And I think that weather markets could be an avenue there. So there are like hurricane specific markets and things like that. And say that there's, some type of premium there that the buyer of the insurance that says like if a hurricane hits, and it causes this much damage or something like that, I might actually be the one willing to be the insurer and take that bet if they're paying a premium on it. So I think it's an interesting future, and maybe we can, get more into that in a future episode.
I love that, and I think there's a future episode about. I want to talk about climate hedging and catastrophe risk and how insurance markets work. I think it's a super interesting area that is. I spend a lot of time actually researching myself. These markets about hurricanes don't have a lot of liquidity right now on prediction markets, but in terms of where the space could go, I think it's a super interesting area to explore. I'd love to talk to people that understand the reinsurance industry deeply, or could tell me why this is not going to work if it's a dumb idea.
All right. Until next time, that's a wrap. Thanks,
All right,
Andrew.
see you, Aaron.